Hello and welcome to Jerry's Pats Page 2013 regular season recap. My name is Jerry Bourget, and I'm going to give you a summary of the 2013 regular season for our favorite team, the New England Patriots. So without further ado and time restraints, let's get started. Let's start with the adversity that the Patriots would have to go through. The Patriots offseason would see Wes Welker leave to join Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos. The Patriots would also release wide receiver Brandon Lloyd for lack of production and locker room issues. Rob Gronkowski would be suffering from back and forearm injuries that would keep him out for most of the season, and he'd eventually be placed on injured reserve after a low hit during a Cleveland Browns game at Gillette Stadium. Tight end Aaron Hernandez would be arrested on murder charges, and as soon as those charges were official, the Patriots would release him. Running back and third down specialist Danny Woodhead would leave to join Phillip Rivers in the San Diego Chargers. This, of course, adding another loss to the offense for the Patriots to deal with. Then Shane Vereen would break his wrist in the first game of the season against Buffalo and be lost for more than half the season. Return specialist Leon Washington was brought in to help in a return game, but was injured just about the whole season and was lost. And if these losses weren't enough, the Patriots would suffer losses on the offensive line as well. Nate Solder, Sebastian Vollmer would go down. The losses would mount as Logan Mankins would later have to move to left tackle to help protect Tom Brady. These losses did not only affect the offense, the defense had trouble as well. Nose tackle and defensive captain Vince Wilfork would go down with an ankle injury versus the Atlanta Falcons and be placed on injured reserve for the rest of the season. Of course, this would leave a huge hole in the middle of the Patriots' defense. Defensive end Tommy Kelly would be lost against the Bengals in Cincinnati. He would go down with a knee injury. He made a brief return, but he was unable to play, and he would be lost to the rest of the season. Defensive lineman and team captain Gerard Mayo would be lost to the season as well after he suffered a pectoral injury ending his season. Cornerback Aqib Talib would miss time due to a hip injury, and what it boils down to is basically Wes Welker, Danny Woodhead, Brandon Lloyd, Leon Washington, Rob Gronkowski, Aaron Hernandez, Sebastian Vollmer, Nate Solder, Vince Wilfork, Tommy Kelly, and Gerard Mayo. It is amazing that the Patriots would lose players of this caliber and still manage to be the second best team in the AFC. Coaching has a lot to do with it. Bill Belichick, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated coaches in the NFL. Longtime offensive lineman coach Dante Starnecchia is by far one of the best and most underrated line coaches in the NFL also. Don't forget, he's been with the Patriots since they went to Super Bowl 20, back with Coach Berry. With that said, let's take a look at the Patriots' final regular season statistics. The Patriots finished the season at 12-4. They are the 2013 AFC East Division champions, and they have secured a first-round bye, clinching the AFC's number 2 seed. The Patriots were 8-0 at Gillette Stadium and 4-4 on the road. Here are some important offensive stats for 2013. Start with the quarterback, Tom Brady. And he finished the year with 628 attempts, and he got 380 completions for 4,343 yards. That's a completion percentage of 60.5%. Yards per attempt would be 6.9. He'd have 25 touchdowns and throw 11 interceptions. That, of course, has a lot to do with the new rookie receivers. A lot of them weren't Brady's fault. His long was 81 yards. He has been sacked 40 times for 256 yards, and he finishes with an 87.3 quarterback rating. Looking at some of his receivers, of course, the loss of Wes Welker, we would be looking for someone to fill the shoes. It was thought that Danny Amendola would fill those shoes when he was signed as a free agent, but the leading receiver ended up being Julian Edelman. Listen to these numbers. Julian Edelman would finish with 105 receptions for 1,056 yards, an average of 10.1 yards. His long was 44 yards, and he'd finish with 6 touchdowns. Danny Amendola would be second. He'd have 54 receptions for 633 yards. He averaged 11.7 yards per catch. His long was 57 yards, and he had 2 touchdowns. And don't forget, he had been kind of banged up, so he missed time. He missed a lot of time, actually. Next up for receiving will be Shane Vereen with 47 receptions for 427 yards. His long was 50, the side route, where he was able to do that, to pull that off. He finished with 3 touchdowns. Coming back for half the season, Rob Gronkowski was fourth, 39 receptions, 592 yards, and he averaged 15.2 yards per catch. Ouch. So that's going to be tough to replace, especially in the playoffs. His long was 50 yards, and he had 4 touchdowns. Aaron Dobson, the rookie, had 37 catches for 519 yards. His average was 14 yards a catch. His long was 81 yards, and he finished with 4 touchdowns. Fellow rookie Kembrell Tompkins rounds it out. He had 32 receptions for 466 yards, an average of 14.6 yards per catch. His long was 49 yards, and he also had 4 touchdowns. Looking at some of the running backs, Stephen Ridley, though he did have fumbling issues this year and was taken out and benched quite a bit, he finished with 178 carries for 773 yards. Of course, last year he had 1,200. He averaged 4.3 yards per run. His long was 29 yards, and he did have 7 touchdowns. LeGarrette Blount would be next. These are season totals for the past 3 games. It's been LeGarrette Blount all the way. He had 153 carries. He finished with 772 yards. He had a 5-yard carry average per carry, and his long was 47. He did have 7 touchdowns as well. Brandon Bolden had 55 carries for 271 yards. He had 46 yards as his long. He had 3 touchdowns. And Shane Vereen would round it out with 44 carries, 208 yards, and 1 touchdown. The Patriots' offense, despite all the losses, still managed to do pretty good league-wise in the rankings. The Patriots scored an average of 27.8 points per game, which was 3rd best in the NFL. Yards per game, 384.5, which is 7th best in the NFL. Passing yards, they were in the top 10 still. They were 10th at 255.4 yards per game. And in rushing, they were also in the top 10. They were 9th with 129.1 yards per game. These are good. Remember all the losses that they've had on the offensive side of the ball. Looking at some of the defensive numbers, again, we had Vince Wilfork go down, Tommy Kelly, Gerard Mayo, and don't forget Brandon Spikes. You take away all these guys, and you're going to have a lot of holes to fill. Some of the players here, the leading tackler on the team was Dante Hightower. He combined for 97 combined tackles. He had 55 total with 42 assists. He did have a sack. Next up will be Steve Gregory, the safety. He had 79 combined tackles, 50 total, 29 assists. He also had a sack. Next up will be Brandon Spikes, finishing the year at 86 tackles, 48 total with 38 assists. Devin McCourty would have 69 tackles. He would recover 2 fumbles. Kyle Arrington would finish with 62 tackles, 48 total, 14 assists. He'd have 2 sacks and 2 fumble recoveries. Rob Ninkovich would finish with 91 total tackles, 42 total and 49 assisted. He'd have 8 sacks and he'd recover 2 fumbles. Chandler Jones would have finished the season with 79 tackles, 40 total, 39 assists, and he'd have 11.5 sacks and he'd recover 1 fumble. Gerard Mayo would be next up with 55 total tackles, 35 total, 20 assisted, and he had 1.5 sacks on the season. Cornerback Aqib Talib would finish the season with 41 total tackles, 35 total, 6 assisted, and he'd have 1 fumble recovery. Looking over at the interception part, Logan Ryan, the Patriots cornerback rookie, 3rd round draft pick, would finish with 5 interceptions that would be returned for a total of 82 yards. He was averaging 16.4 yards per interception. His long return was 79 yards, and he did have a touchdown. Aqib Talib would be next with 4 interceptions. Total 12 yards brought back. His average per interception would be 3 yards. He brought it back long of 14 yards. Duron Harmon would have 2 interceptions, and he'd finish with a total of 44 yards, and his long would be 42. Again, a lot of losses on the defense, so let's look at some of the defensive total numbers, okay? Points allowed. Patriots were in the top 10 at 21.1 points per game. Yards, they were 26 with 373.1, but that had a lot to do with Vince Wilfork being out and the Keep Talib being banged up in the secondary. Passing yards, they were in the top 20. They were 18th with 239 yards per game. And rushing yards allowed, you could tell that Vince Wilfork was out because they were 30th, giving up an average of 134.1 yards per game. Overall, these numbers are impressive given the amount of injuries that the Patriots had to deal with. As of right now, they're going to be preparing for the AFC Championship game to take on Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos. The wild card, the Patriots, of course, as you know, won a divisional round against the Indianapolis Colts. And the NFC Championship game is going to be the San Francisco 49ers going to the Seattle Seahawks. Well, I know that there's a lot of information on this broadcast, and it's kind of a brief one. But I just kind of wanted to get you the basics, the meat of the stats for the 2013 season. But I hope you enjoyed the program as much as I did. Hopefully this postseason ends with a Patriots trip to New York to win the Super Bowl. How great would that be to see Tom Brady and Bill Belichick hoist the Lombardi Trophy in Rex Ryan and Eli Manning's house? That would be fantastic. Well, that'll just about do it. This is Jerry's Pat's Page broadcast of the 2013 regular season recap. Remember to check out the latest game reports as well as my videos on my website at www.jerryspatspage.com. Until next time, thanks for watching, take care, and go Pats!